This fake trash belongs on the floor, just like you.
7:14 on the last Tuesday in September, in the marble atrium of Ashford and Vale on Michigan Avenue. Ava Miller knelt on the floor in a navy dress to gather the 3 pieces of her grandmother's jade ring. Preston Cole had said it loud enough for the nearest bidders to turn, and he had not bothered to lower his voice when he said it, because he had never once believed she would be the one still standing at the end of the night. Under the runner, aside her knee, sat a manila folder that did not belong to the auction house, its corner tagged with a courier sticker from a law office 9 blocks north, and no one in the atrium had noticed it arrive. 14 minutes from now, a man neither of them had spoken to yet would lift his paddle for lot 114, and Preston would find out exactly how far a forged signature travels before it comes back around. It is 8:14 in the evening in Chicago right now, and somewhere in this city, a woman is being told that the thing she built with her own hands belongs to someone else. If you have ever watched a room decide in real time whose word counts and whose does not, you already know the sound that follows. Stay with me, because in 4 minutes, the room is going to change its mind. Ava did not answer him. She set the 2 larger pieces of the ring on her palm, closed her fingers around them, and rose to her feet with the kind of stillness that came from 12 years of standing beside million-dollar canvases while other people argued about what they were worth. The bidders, nearest the aisle, had gone quiet in the specific way a room goes quiet when it senses that someone has said something it will regret repeating later, and a woman in a cream blazer 2 rows back lowered her catalog an inch, watching. Preston straightened his cuff and looked past Ava toward the podium, already rehearsing the version of the story where he had said nothing at all. The auctioneer, a narrow man named Colby Reyes, who had run the house's evening sales for 11 years, cleared his throat and asked whether the room was ready to resume, and nobody at the front table answered him either. Ava did not cry, and she did not raise her voice. And this unsettled Preston more than tears would have, because tears he knew how to manage. She slid the 3rd smallest shard of jade off the marble with 2 fingers and closed it into her palm with the others, and the small click of stone against stone was the only sound she made. The gallery director seated beside Preston, a woman named Renata Diaz, who had underwritten the consignment, reached over and touched his sleeve once, a gesture that asked him to sit down, and he did not. Ava turned, walked 11 steps to the coat check without looking back at the table, and did not look at lot 114 on the easel either, though everyone in the room assumed she would. At the coat check, before she took her coat, she opened the small leather notebook she carried in place of a phone case and wrote down a single number from the display card beside the easel, the internal lot reference printed in 8-point type that nobody else in the room had bothered to read. She photographed the consignment placard beside lot 114 with her phone angled low so the flash would not catch, and the image showed a signature line she had never in her life put a pen to. She did not confront the coat check attendant or ask to see the house's paperwork, because 11 years in this industry had taught her that the person who reacts first is the person who loses the room. And instead, she zipped the phone into an inside pocket and asked in a voice pitched for exactly one person to hear what time the house's registrar office closed. The attendant, a young man who had clearly not been told anything about what just happened at the front table, said 9 o'clock, and Ava thanked him and stepped out into the September air, already composing in her head the 3 questions she intended to have answered by 9:15. 3 years earlier, in the small dining room of a bungalow on the south side, Loretta Miller had set a jade ring on the table beside a stack of unpaid utility bills and told her daughter that some things you protect first and afford later. Loretta had raised Ava alone after Ava's father left when Ava was 9, working the counter at a dry cleaner on Cottage Grove for 11 years before switching to bookkeeping for a family funeral home. And she had never once let her daughter believe that not having money was the same as not having worth. The one thing Loretta had kept from her own mother was the ring and a small, unsigned oil painting of a harbor that had hung above the sofa for as long as Ava could remember, a picture nobody in the family had ever had appraised because nobody had ever imagined it was real. The ring itself had come north in 1958, wrapped in a handkerchief inside a hat box carried by Ava's great-grandmother on a train from Greenwood, Mississippi, and it had been resized twice, once for Loretta's mother and once for Loretta, the jeweler's mark still visible on the inside of the band if you turned it to the light. Loretta used to say that a woman should own exactly 2 things outright in her life, one she could wear and one she could hang on a wall, and that everything else was just furniture passing through her hands on its way to somebody else's house. She said it while paying the funeral home's light bill 3 days late and while turning down a loan from her sister rather than put the ring up as collateral. and Ava had absorbed the lesson so thoroughly that she built an entire profession around telling other people what their two things were actually worth. When Loretta died 3 years ago in March, Ava had the painting cleaned as a private grief project, and the conservator peeled back a century of varnish to reveal a signature in the lower corner belonging to a minor but documented American realist named Edwin Marsh. A discovery that turned a sentimental object into an asset worth $1,800,000. Ava built her career on exactly this kind of reading, the ability to see through the fog of time and bad varnish to what a thing actually was, and by 34, she held an accredited senior appraiser credential and a client list that ran from private collectors to 2 regional museums. Her method was procedural to the point of ritual raking light across the surface. First, then ultraviolet, then infrared reflectography, if the client's budget allowed it, because paint hides what pencil does not, and a signature added later sits differently under infrared than one laid down in the original campaign. She had used that same infrared equipment 11 days ago on her mother's painting's provenance file, on the canvas, checking whether the consignment paperwork Preston had filed with Ashford and Vale carried her actual signature, and the machine had told her quietly and without opinion that it did not. Document examination worked on the same principle as canvas examination, because ink sat on paper, the way paint sat on ground, and a signature added after the fact. Even a good forgery tended to sit at a slightly different depth than one written in the same sitting as the rest of the page. Ava ran the consignment letter under an infrared filter at 900 nanometers and watched the loop of the letter A in her own supposed signature fluoresce a shade lighter than the rest of the document, a mismatch that meant one thing only: that the pen had not been the same pen and the ink had not been laid down on the same day. She had learned the technique 8 years earlier from a conservator at the Regional Museum who dated 3 forged Audubon prints in an afternoon, using nothing but a modified camera and a patience that most people mistook for stubbornness. And Ava had taken the man's course twice, once for the certificate, and once because she liked how certain the machine made her feel. Certainty was the thing Ava had built her whole adult life around, because uncertainty was what had let Preston walk into a notary's office in June with a stack of papers and her name already printed at the bottom. 6 years earlier, Ava had been called in to authenticate a disputed Hudson River school landscape for a downtown collector, standing alone in a service elevator at 4 in the morning with a loupe and a portable UV lamp, because the estate's lawyers needed an answer before the courthouse opened. Daniel Seo had been the collector's silent partner in the purchase present that morning, only because he could not sleep and had wandered down from his office 2 floors up. And what he noticed first was not the woman in the elevator, but the fact that she had not once looked up from the canvas in 40 minutes. He asked her a single question, whether the craquelure pattern in the sky was consistent with the ground layer, and she answered without turning around that it was not, that someone had restretched the canvas at some point, and the sky had been overpainted by a different hand entirely. It was the kind of answer that told him she had not noticed who he was, which he found to his own mild surprise more interesting than anything else that had happened to him that year. He stood at a distance while she finished watching her mark up in a condition report in pencil. Small architect's handwriting numbers keyed to a diagram of the canvas she had sketched freehand in under 2 minutes. When she finally straightened and peeled off her cotton gloves, he introduced himself only as Daniel. No company name, no title, and she shook his hand once briskly, the way people shake hands when they still have 4 more hours of work ahead of them. She told him unprompted that the piece was worth roughly 60% of what the estate lawyers were hoping to hear, and that she would be putting that number in writing whether they liked it or not. And he had laughed once quietly because he could not remember the last time someone in that building had said a true thing to him without checking his face first for permission. They did not exchange numbers that night, only names, and Daniel filed hers away the way he filed everything that struck him as precise in a world that mostly was not. He did not know 7 years later that a woman with a jade ring in her closed fist was standing in the same auction house where his fund now held a note secured by a painting he had never seen but whose file he had read twice. The folder by the runner had his lawyer's return address on it, and it had been sitting there since 6 o'clock, and nobody in the room understood yet that the reason it had arrived before the sale even opened was that somebody had already decided the sale was not going to finish the way the catalog said it would. Renata Diaz picked the folder up off the floor without asking anyone's permission, turned it over once, and set it back down exactly where she had found it. She did not open it. She did not need to, because the courier sticker in the corner carried a name she recognized from 3 separate closing documents that spring. And none of those 3 deals had gone the way her client told her they had. 16 months ago, before the divorce was final, Preston sat in the back office of Cole and Whitfield Gallery reading a regional art journal that had run a short profile on the rediscovery of an Edwin Marsh harbor scene attributed only to a private Chicago collection, and he recognized the crop of the photograph immediately because it had hung above his mother-in-law's sofa for the entire 6 years of his marriage. The gallery's line of credit was 90 days past its second extension by then, and Renata Diaz had already told him in the careful language people use when they are done being careful that the bank would not extend it a third time without new collateral on the books. The gallery owed $41,000 in back rent on the River North space, and another $280,000 on a line of credit taken out to cover a consignment deal that had fallen through the previous winter when a Milwaukee collector backed out of a sale 3 days before closing and left Preston holding a bridge loan with nothing on the other side of it. Hyatt remained on paper co-executor of Loretta Miller's small estate trust, a status Ava had granted him in the numb first weeks after her mother's funeral and had simply never revoked because revoking it would have meant sitting across a table from a lawyer and admitting 18 months early that the marriage was already over. Preston told himself in the specific language people use to make theft sound like timing that he was not taking anything, only accelerating an outcome that was going to happen eventually anyway, since Ava had no plans to sell the painting and he needed the credit line refinanced before the bank called it due in the fall. Preston kept a set of estate stationery in a drawer at the gallery letterhead. Nobody had used since the funeral home paperwork was settled, and he ran his thumb along the embossed seal for a long time before he put the journal down. He did not tell Ava about the article, and he did not ask her a single question about the painting for another 11 months, which was in its own way the clearest signal available that something had already been decided. In April, 4 months after the divorce was finalized, the storage facility on Elston that held the painting under joint account access received a written request on Cole and Whitfield letterhead to transfer the crate to a private art handling warehouse near the gallery, citing an upcoming conservation review. The facility manager, a man who had processed thousands of these transfers and had no reason to doubt a signature that matched the account on file, approved the move without a phone call, in lot 114, though it had no lot number yet, spent the next 5 months 11 miles from where Ava believed it still sat. Preston changed nothing about the storage account's paperwork beyond the transfer authorization, careful to leave the joint listing intact because an obvious seizure would have triggered an alert and a subtle one would not. The private warehouse, he moved the crate to a climate-controlled art logistics operation off Kedzie Avenue, charged him $190 a month for a slot barely big enough for the crate itself, and he paid the first 3 months in cash so the transaction would not appear on a card statement anyone else could see. He visited the warehouse twice that summer, both times alone, both times signing the visitor log under his own name because the facility required government identification and there was no forging his way around that particular door. Ava found out by accident in July when she called the Elston facility to schedule an unrelated appraisal photography session and was told politely that the item she was asking about had been relocated by the co-account holder 3 months earlier. She did not call Preston, and she did not drive to the gallery, and she did not post anything, text anyone in anger, or leave a message on his voicemail that he could later characterize as harassment. Instead, she called Nia Ferris, ordered a certified copy of the estate trust documents, and spent the better part of a Saturday afternoon at Nia's dining table, cross-referencing every signature on file against the ones she remembered actually making. Nia pulled a legal pad from a kitchen drawer and started a timeline in blue ink. 1 column for dates, 1 for documents, 1 for the name of whoever had filed each one, a habit left over from 11 years of building fraud cases, the slow way, 1 dated receipt at a time. By the end of that Saturday, the pad held 9 entries, none of them proof of anything on its own, but Nia had built cases out of thinner columns before, and she told Ava, closing the notebook, that the job now was patience, not confrontation, because the moment Preston learned he was being watched, he would stop leaving a trail. Ava did not return a single call from Preston that entire month, not out of anger, but because Nia had told her plainly that every conversation with him from that point forward was a conversation a jury might someday hear read aloud, and she intended to make sure there was nothing in it she would regret. The trust paperwork itself was clean, every signature on it hers, because Preston had not needed to forge anything to move a painting he was still legally, if barely, entitled to authorize. What he needed to forge came later, and it came because Ashford and Vale's intake department required a separate document, a consignment authorization naming Ava as sole beneficial owner, releasing the piece for sale since the estate trust itself had technically dissolved on the one-year anniversary of Loretta's death and could no longer sign anything at all. Preston had the letter drafted by a paralegal at a firm he used for gallery contracts, careful to describe the language exactly as an authorization from Ava herself, and he signed it in a notary's office on Wabash on the 3rd of June at 4:52 in the afternoon alone, using a name and a signature that were not his own to give. He had practiced the signature for 2 evenings beforehand, copying it from a joint tax return he still had a scanned copy of from their last year of filing together, tracing the loop of the A and the flat cross of the M until his hand could produce it without looking at the reference sheet propped against his monitor. The notary's office on Wabash shared a suite with a check-cashing storefront and a travel agency that had gone out of business 2 years earlier, the kind of location where a busy clerk stamped 40 documents an hour without asking many questions, and the security camera above the entrance, an older model. The landlord had never bothered to replace, recorded everyone who came through the door in grainy color that time-stamped itself automatically in the corner of the frame. Harold Voss found the first irregularity 9 days before the auction, not in the signature itself, but in the notary seal beside it, a round stamp whose registration number, when he cross-referenced the state's public database, belonged to a commission that had expired the previous November. The notary listed on the document, a woman named Patricia Alvarez, had in fact retired from active commission 7 months before the date stamped on Ava's supposed authorization, which meant the stamp on the page had either been reused illegally or manufactured outright. Harold called Ava at 9 that night, and the two of them sat on a video call for 40 minutes while he walked the cursor slowly across a scanned image of the seal, showing her the hairline gap in the eagle's wing that every genuine Alvarez stamp carried, and this one did not. I explained that state notary stamps were manufactured by a small number of licensed vendors, each of whom kept a die record on file, and that a competent forensic examiner could usually trace a counterfeit stamp back to whichever amateur kit had produced it, though that step would take longer than 9 days to run down properly. What troubled Harold more than the stamp itself was the ink beneath it, a blue-black gel that under his loupe sat noticeably darker than the ink in the body text above it, suggesting the signature block had been added to the page after the rest of the document was already printed and likely already notarized for something else entirely. Ava asked him only one question that night: whether the discrepancy would hold up if a forensic examiner from the other side challenged it, and Harold told her that discrepancies this specific rarely survived a second look because forgers were good at copying a signature's shape and consistently bad at copying its timeline. He offered to write a preliminary findings memo that same week, 3 pages, methodology first, conclusion last, exactly the format a licensing board or a courtroom would expect, and Ava told him to hold off on filing it anywhere until she had a fuller picture of how the painting had moved and who exactly now stood to profit from its sale. 2 weeks after the storage transfer, Preston made his second move, and this one was not quiet at all. He filed a formal complaint with the state appraiser's licensing board, alleging that Ava had a conflict of interest in authenticating her own late mother's painting and had inflated its valuation to benefit personally from the estate, a claim that, if it stuck, could suspend her credential for up to a year while the board investigated. The complaint landed on a Thursday, forwarded to every client on Ava's active roster by board policy, including the 2 regional museums that made up nearly a third of her annual income, and by Friday afternoon, one of them had quietly postponed a contract renewal, pending the outcome. The board's form letter used careful procedural language, stating only that an inquiry had been opened and that Ava's credential remained active pending review. But 3 of her private clients called within the week to ask in one polite phrasing or another whether they ought to wait for a different appraiser on their current engagements. One of them, a downtown collector she had worked with for 6 years, asked the question so gently that Ava almost thanked him for it, before she understood what he was actually asking, and she told him the truth, that the complaint was without merit and that she would send him the board's docket number so he could verify that himself. Ava read the board's notice standing in her own kitchen with the kettle going cold behind her, and she did not throw anything, and she did not call Preston, and she did not post a single word about it anywhere a client might see. She forwarded the notice to Nia, printed a copy for the growing folder Harold had started calling, without irony, the file, and set a reminder on her phone to request the board's full complaint packet the moment its 10-day window opened. Renata Diaz, meanwhile, had begun asking her own questions because the courier slip she had recognized in the atrium belonged to a process server's office. She had used twice that spring for an entirely different client, a real estate matter involving a change of control clause on a defaulted note. She placed one call to that office on the Monday before the auction, gave a case reference number from memory, and listened for 4 minutes without saying much of anything at all. When she hung up, she understood two things that nobody else in the gallery yet did: that the note behind Lot 114 had changed hands 6 weeks earlier, and that whoever held it now had already filed the paperwork to make sure everyone in that atrium would eventually find out. Renata did not tell Preston what she had learned. She had underwritten enough failed consignments to know that the smartest thing a person in her position could do once a deal turned this dangerous was to have clean hands and a clear memory of exactly when she had known what. She locked the call notes in her own desk drawer, not the gallery's shared file, and she did not mention the name on the note to anyone at all. Not even when Preston asked her 3 days later whether everything was set for Tuesday. She told him it was. It was not a lie exactly, only an answer that left out the one detail that would have changed everything, and Renata, watching him walk back to his office whistling, understood that she had just stopped protecting him. 6 weeks before the auction, an analyst on Daniel Seo's acquisitions team flagged a small distressed note inside a larger portfolio. SEO Capital Partners had purchased from a specialty art lender, liquidating its book a loan of $612,450, secured by an Edwin Marsh Harbor painting file named Lot 114 Miller. Daniel read the file twice before he said anything to anyone because the borrower listed was not the name on the underlying collateral, and the collateral itself, once he pulled the appraisal attached to the loan application, carried a valuation signed by an appraiser named Ava Miller, ASA, whose report he recognized before he even reached the signature line. The loan file included a payment history showing 11 on-time monthly installments at an interest rate of 11%, followed by a note from the liquidating lender that the borrower had requested an early payoff, quote, a request that in Daniel's experience usually meant someone was trying to close out a debt quietly before anyone looked too closely at how it had originated. He pulled the underlying appraisal a second time and read Ava's methodology section line by line: the raking light, the ultraviolet pass, the infrared reflectography she had run on the canvas itself before she had ever thought to run it on a piece of paper. And it struck him reading it at 11 at night in an empty office that the same rigor that had made her report airtight was exactly the tool someone would eventually need to unmake whatever had been built on top of it. He did not call her. He told himself, reading her report a third time at 11 that night, that calling her now, before he understood what he was actually looking at, would only put her in the position of having to explain something to a stranger she barely remembered, and he had learned a long time ago that the most respectful form of help was the kind that did not require the other person to perform gratitude for it. Instead, he asked his general counsel, a careful woman named Priya Nair, to run a full title and lien history on the collateral. And what came back over the following 4 days confirmed that the loan had been originated using a consignment authorization the borrower claimed came from the collateral's true owner. The portfolio purchase agreement SEO Capital had signed with the liquidating lender included, buried on page 41, a standard change of control clause allowing the new note holder to accelerate or freeze any loan discovered to involve fraud in its origination documents. A clause, Priya confirmed, was fully enforceable the moment Daniel chose to invoke it. Invoking it meant SEO Capital, not Preston, would become the party of record with legal standing over the collateral, able to halt any sale demand, full documentation of the chain of custody, and refer the matter to the state's attorney if the fraud held up all of it through filings and notices rather than through anything that happened in a single room in a single evening. Priya was careful to explain to Daniel exactly what the clause did not let him do, which was arrest anyone, freeze any account belonging to Preston personally, or force the auction house to cancel the sale outright without cause shown, since Ashford and Vale answered to its own consignment agreement and would need to see documented proof of the fraud before it would act. Daniel listened to all of it without interrupting, the same way he listened to most things, and asked only one clarifying question at the end: whether the timing of the filing could be adjusted by even a single day if it meant giving Ava's own evidence more room to stand on its own first. What the clause did allow, cleanly and on the record, was for CO Capital's counsel to appear at the sale with a formal notice asserting a superior lien, a document any competent auctioneer would recognize immediately as grounds to pull a lot rather than risk selling a title that could unwind in litigation within the week. Priya drafted the notice to be served in person time for delivery before the gavel opened bidding, because a notice that arrived after a sale had closed created a much longer and costlier fight than one that arrived before it. Daniel signed the invocation order on a Thursday morning alone in his office on the 31st floor and told Priya to prepare the notice for filing the following week, time to land before the scheduled auction date rather than after it, so that whatever happened at Ashford and Vale would already have a legitimate claim sitting behind it. He did not ask Priya to notify Ava directly. He asked instead whether there was a lawful way to make certain nothing happened to her professional standing, while the filing worked its way through, and Priya told him that was a harder problem, one that paperwork alone would not solve. His mother, Grace Seo, called him twice that week about an entirely different matter. The family's annual memorial dinner for his grandfather, a man who had built a shipping business from a single leased warehouse in Busan, and had never once in Daniel's memory spoken a sentence to his eldest grandson that was not also an instruction. Daniel was the eldest son of the eldest son, a position that in his grandfather's house had come with an assumed shape business school, a seat on the family holding company's board by 30, a wife chosen with the family's approval before 35, and Daniel had declined every part of it in order, starting with the board seat and ending most recently with his mother's third attempt to arrange dinner with a family friend's daughter. His grandmother still called him by the Korean name printed on his birth certificate, a name almost no one else had used aloud in 11 years, and he did not correct her when she used it because it was the one place he still let the old shape hold. Grace kept a small brass frame on the hallway table, holding his grandfather's photograph beside a bowl that was refilled with rice and seaweed soup every year on the anniversary of his death, and Daniel, though he had not lived in that house in 15 years, still drove out to Winnetka every year to sit beside it and say nothing, because saying nothing was in that family its own form of respect. There had been a period in his late 20s when Daniel tried explaining himself to his grandfather, directly laying out in careful prepared language why he wanted to build his own fund instead of stepping into the shipping company's finance division, and his grandfather had listened without interrupting, and then simply refilled his own tea and changed the subject, a response Daniel had spent years learning to read as the closest thing to permission the old man was ever going to give. I had learned early that survival in his grandfather's house meant choosing silence over explanation, and it was a habit that had followed him into every part of his adult life, including now a filing sitting quietly on his desk that would change the terms of a stranger's evening, without her ever knowing his name was attached to it until it was already done. The following Tuesday, Daniel attended a public lecture Ava gave at the Cultural Center on authenticating mid-century American realism, standing at the back of a half-full room, and he left before the question period ended so that she would not see him. He noticed watching her field a difficult question from an audience member about a disputed marsh attribution that she answered the way she had 7 years earlier in that service elevator, without hedging, without checking the room's face for permission first. He arranged through Priya, and without his name on any of the paperwork for CO Capital, to quietly extend a standing line of appraisal work to one of the two museums that had paused their contract with Ava, structured as an unrelated grant, so that no one at the museum would connect the timing to anything at all. The grant carried no conditions beyond a standard conflict of interest disclosure, and it named no preferred appraiser, so that if anyone ever traced the money, they would find nothing but a fund with a stated interest in supporting regional museum conservation work, a category SEO Capital had in fact funded twice before under entirely different circumstances. Priya asked him once, filing the paperwork, whether he wanted his name kept off it for legal reasons or personal ones, and Daniel said only that it did not matter which, since the answer would look the same either way. Ava, 5 days before the auction, drove to the Kedzie Avenue warehouse where the painting had sat for 5 months and asked the front desk for the facility's visitor log, a request the manager was reluctant to honor until Nia, on speakerphone, cited the specific statute that made the log part of the joint accounts records. The log showed exactly 2 entries under Preston's name that summer, each with a government ID number recorded beside it, dates, that lined up precisely with the 2 occasions he had visited the crate alone. Ava cross-referenced those 2 dates against the notary timestamp Harold had flagged and against the courier record Renata had unknowingly confirmed to Nia's paralegal earlier that week, and for the first time, the entire sequence sat in front of her as a single, unbroken line. Storage, transfer, notary visit, consignment filing, each one dated, each one signed, each one now impossible to explain any other way. She photographed the visitor log page and emailed it to Harold and Nia within the hour, the last piece that turned three separate suspicions into one file, a licensing board or a courtroom, could not easily wave away. Harold called back within 20 minutes to confirm what he had suspected since the ink test that the paper trail now closed cleanly enough to submit. He did not yet know that somewhere on the 31st floor of a building 4 miles away, a filing bearing an entirely different signature was already sitting in a folder, waiting on a courier, addressed to the same auction house. Ava had a ticket to attend the following Tuesday night. Nia read through the completed file that same evening, storage, transfer, notary, discrepancy, warehouse log, and told Ava it was strong enough to bring to the board, and if it came to it, strong enough to bring to a courtroom. But that timing mattered, and filing it one day too early might only give Preston room to destroy what paperwork he still controlled before anyone could subpoena it. Ava agreed to wait until after the scheduled sale to file anything formally, a decision that would put her 5 days later standing in the middle of an auction house atrium with no idea that a second entirely separate notice was already converging on the same room from a direction she could not have predicted. Harold spent those 5 days quietly finalizing his written report, methodology, first conclusion, last, so that if the moment came to present it, there would be nothing left to prepare and nothing left to explain. Ava returned to her seat at the front table 11 minutes after Preston's remark. The 3 pieces of the jade ring folded into a handkerchief in her clutch, and she took the same chair she had occupied all evening at the same table, facing the same easel, holding lot 114 under the same gallery lights. Colby Reyes resumed the sale, working through lots 111 through 113 with the practiced rhythm of a man who had not noticed anything unusual had happened at all, and the room settled back into the ordinary hum of paddles and side conversation. Preston sat 2 seats down. His color returned, his cuff straightened twice more, already, telling a version of the last 11 minutes to Renata in a low voice. A version in which he had said something regrettable but understandable, the kind of thing any man might say under financial pressure. Renata did not respond to any of it, and she kept her eyes on the podium, and the folder Daniel's team had delivered sat by her foot exactly where she had set it back down. The room around them filled back in slowly, catalogs rustling, a waiter circling with a tray of water glasses. Nobody had ordered the particular low murmur of a crowd that has decided collectively and without discussion to pretend the last several minutes had not happened. Ava kept her clutch closed in her lap. The ring's 3 pieces wrapped inside a handkerchief her mother had ironed for her own wedding 29 years earlier, and she did not check her phone, and she did not look toward the door. Preston leaned toward Ava once while Colby called lot 113 sold and told her quietly enough that only she could hear it, that whatever she thought she was going to do about tonight, the sale would be final, the moment the gavel came down, and that she had exactly as much power in this room as she had ever had in their marriage, which was none. He said it the way a man says something he has rehearsed for months and never quite gotten to use, savoring the shape of it in his mouth. And he did not notice that Colby had just called lot 114 to the floor, or that a man in a dark gray suit had risen from a chair along the back wall and begun walking unhurried toward the front table. Preston reached for his water glass with the loose confidence of a man who believed the hardest part of his evening was already behind him, and he glanced once at the easel holding the harbor painting, doing the private arithmetic of what $1,800,000 minus the gallery's debts would leave him once the sale closed. I had told Renata in the car on the way over that by midnight this would all be a story he told at dinner parties, the time his ex-wife made a scene over a painting she never even knew was real until he found the appraiser who proved it. Colby announced the lot, The Harbor Scene by Edwin Marsh, opening the bidding at $1,400,000, and Renata rose from her seat without waiting to be recognized, stepping toward the podium with the folder now open in her hand. She did not ask for permission to speak, and she informed Colby in a voice pitched for the room to hear that the house had received a formal notice of superior lien on the collateral behind lot 114 filed by counsel for its current note holder, and that gallery policy required any sale to pause immediately when such a notice was received prior to the fall of the gavel. Colby, who had run enough sales to know exactly what those words meant for his evening, set down his gavel without striking it and asked the room's indulgence for a brief recess. Daniel reached the front table as the recess was announced, and he set a second folder beside Renata's, this one bearing Priya Nair's signature block, and he did not raise his voice, and he did not look at Preston at all. He addressed Ava first by name and told her that CO Capital held the note behind the painting and had reason to believe the consignment authorization used to bring it to sale was fraudulent. And he asked formally whether she was in fact the Ava Miller named as the sole beneficial owner on that document. Ava told him she was and that she had never signed it, and she set her own folder on the table beside his and Renata's 3 separate files converging into one stack in front of a room that had gone almost entirely silent. Her folder was pale gray, an inch thick. The tabs inside, color-coded the same way she organized every provenance file she had built in 12 years of practice, and she opened it flat on the table rather than handing pages across one at a time so that anyone leaning in could read the sequence for themselves without waiting on her. Colby set his gavel down beside the podium microphone and came around to stand at the corner of the table, and for the first time all evening, he looked less like a man running a sale and more like a man about to sign his name to something. Preston's water glass stopped halfway to his mouth. The first sheet Ava laid on the table was a printout of the loan's payment history, the $612,450 balance, highlighted in yellow alongside a single circled line item showing the early payoff request filed the same week. The auction was scheduled a number that answered before anyone asked it aloud exactly what this had been for. The second document was the consignment authorization itself, laid face up with Harold Voss's infrared scan clipped behind it, showing the mismatched fluorescence in the signature block. And beside that, the notary seal enlarged on a second page, its missing hairline gap circled in red pen where Harold had marked it 2 nights earlier. Ava turned to the third page slowly enough that the room could read it with her a certified printout of the State Notary Commission database, showing Patricia Alvarez's registration lapsed 7 months before the date stamped on the page in front of them, a discrepancy that made the entire document on its face impossible. She explained it the way she explained a disputed attribution to a room full of skeptical collectors, without theatrics, walking through the timeline once plainly so that anyone in the atrium with a working knowledge of how notary commissions functioned could verify every claim for themselves rather than take her word for it. A man 3 tables back, a retired judge Ava recognized from a museum board she had once presented to, murmured to the woman beside him that he had sat on enough forgery cases in his career to know exactly how this one would resolve, and he did not lower his voice enough to keep Preston from hearing it. Nia, who had arrived with Ava that evening and now stood just behind her shoulder, produced the last item, a single sheet summarizing a recorded voicemail. Preston had left for the paralegal, who drafted the letter retrieved under subpoena from the firm's client intake system 3 days earlier, in which his own voice, time-stamped and unmistakable, asked whether the notary block could be, in his words, cleaned up a little before it went out. The recording itself played once 41 seconds from a small speaker Nia set on the table, Preston's voice thin and confident, in a room that had gone completely still, asking the paralegal not to worry about which notary was technically still active since nobody ever actually checked. Preston stood so quickly, his chair caught against the runner behind him, and he said the recording had been taken out of context, that he had been asking about an entirely different filing. And his voice climbed a register it had not reached all evening, the register of a man discovering in real time that a story he had rehearsed for months does not survive contact with its own audio. Nobody in the room moved until the recording finished, and then a woman near the back, one of the museum representatives Ava had worked with for years, said something too quiet to carry, and the sound that followed her was not silence so much as agreement. Colby asked for the record, and in a voice that carried to every corner of the atrium, whether Preston Cole disputed that the voice on the recording was his own, and Preston did not answer the question, which in that room, in that particular silence, functioned as an answer of its own. 11 weeks earlier in this same atrium, Preston Cole had said that this fake trash belonged on the floor just like her. The seat Ava occupied now at the head of a table, 3 men had just quietly ceded to her without being asked, belonged to her by evidence, not by invitation. Colby, holding the state notary printout in one hand, announced to the room that Lot 114 was withdrawn from sale pending resolution of the ownership dispute, a decision the house's own bylaws required the moment documented fraud was presented before the gavel fell, and he thanked the room for its patience, in a voice that suggested he had never once had to say those particular words before. Preston did not stand, and he did not speak, and the color that had returned to his face 11 minutes earlier drained out of it again as security, summoned by Renata with a single glance toward the door, approached the table and asked him quietly to step outside with them to discuss the matter privately. I was not arrested that night because no crime had yet been charged and no officer of the law stood among the 2 security guards walking him out, but he left the atrium through a side door, reserved for deliveries, past the coat check where Ava had knelt on the floor 11 weeks and 11 minutes ago, and nobody in the room mistook the exit for anything but what it was. Renata did not walk him out, and she did not follow him to the door. And when a junior associate asked her afterwards whether the gallery's remaining consignments needed to be pulled as well, she said yes, all of them, effective immediately, and went to find Colby to say so herself. Ava sat back down at the front table once the recess ended, and Nia sat beside her, and the two of them said nothing at all for a long moment while the room slowly resumed its ordinary business around them. Lot 115 called a paddle raised somewhere near the back, the sound of a sale continuing as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Ava looked once at the empty easel where Lot 114 had stood, now wheeled quietly out of the room by a member of the house's handling staff, and felt something settle in her chest that she did not yet have a word for. Not triumph exactly, closer to the particular quiet that follows a long-held breath finally released. The following week, CO Capital's counsel filed a formal notice halting any further transaction on the collateral, and a separate complaint went to the state's attorney's economic crimes unit, built on the same 4 documents that had just sat on the auction table, now formally entered into a case file with its own docket number. Priya walked Ava through the filing process over 2 phone calls that week, explaining that a state's attorney's review typically took months rather than days, that a grand jury would need to see the same evidence Ava had already assembled long before any charge was filed, and that the most useful thing Ava could do in the meantime was exactly what she had already been doing, keeping every document dated, sourced, and duplicated. Cole and Whitfield Gallery's line of credit, called due by its bank within the month, once the fraud became public, went unpaid, and the gallery filed for bankruptcy protection. 5 months later, its remaining inventory liquidated to cover a fraction of what it owed, a filing that ran 11 pages and listed Ashford and Vale itself as an unsecured creditor for a consignment fee it would now never collect. Renata Diaz was not named in any complaint, and she gave a statement to Priya's office the following week detailing exactly when she had recognized the courier's name and exactly what she had chosen not to tell Preston, a statement that closed, as far as anyone in that office was concerned, any question of her own involvement. Ava's board complaint was dismissed without further inquiry once the packet Harold had prepared reached the reviewing officer, and the letter, closing the file, arrived on the same day as a separate letter reinstating both paused museum contracts in full. The folder Priya had delivered the day of the auction, the one that had sat by the runner since 6 o'clock, closed a question that had opened the moment Renata first turned it over in her hands 11 weeks earlier, without knowing yet whose name was inside it, and now finally everyone in the room did. Daniel remained standing at the corner of the table for the rest of the recess. Not beside Ava exactly, but close enough that anyone watching would understand the 2 folders on the table belonged to people who had, without ever discussing it, arrived at the same conclusion from 2 entirely different directions. He did not touch her arm, and he did not offer her his card, and when Colby finally called the room back to order to resume the sale of Lot 115, an unrelated portrait that nobody that evening particularly cared about, Daniel stepped back from the table the same unhurried way he had approached it, as if the whole exchange had cost him nothing at all, though everyone who had watched it happen understood that it had cost him a great deal of quiet, careful work, spread across 6 weeks that no one in that room would ever fully know about. 7 months after the auction, the state's attorney's economic crimes unit filed formal charges against Preston Cole for forgery and fraud in the 2nd degree, a filing built almost entirely on the 4 documents that had sat on the table that night, supplemented by bank records Priya's office had subpoenaed showing the early payoff request tied directly to the auction date. Preston pleaded guilty. 11 weeks later, rather than take the case to trial, a decision his new attorney recommended once it became clear that a jury would hear both the recording and Harold's testimony on the notary seal, and the plea deal left him with 3 years of probation, a restitution order, and a permanent bar from holding an appraiser's or dealer's license in the state. The restitution order required Preston to repay the outstanding $612,450 to CO Capital, directly a debt the court structured as monthly payments garnished from whatever income he earned going forward, since the gallery itself had nothing left to draw from by the time the bankruptcy trustee finished liquidating its inventory. Renata Diaz found work within 3 months at a competing house downtown in a role with no consignment authority attached to it at all, a demotion she accepted without complaint because she understood better than most people in that industry exactly how close she had come to losing far more than a title. Ashford and Vale, once the ownership dispute cleared, offered to reschedule Lot 114 for a later sale under Ava's name as consignor, and Ava declined, choosing instead to have the painting formally appraised, insured, and hung on loan at the regional museum that had waited out her board complaint without ever dropping her contract. Ava's licensing board sent a second letter that spring, this one not closing a complaint but inviting her to sit on the very review panel that had processed Preston's initial filing against her. A seat she accepted on the condition that her first case would be a training session for new investigators on exactly how a fraudulent complaint like the one filed against her could be identified early. She built out a second line of her practice that year, document forensics, for smaller estates that could not otherwise afford a specialist, teaching 2 evening courses at the same continuing education program where Harold had once taught her, and by the following fall, she had trained 6 new examiners in the same infrared technique that had unmade Preston's letter. The regional museum that reinstated her contract asked her that spring to curate a small exhibition on authentication itself, pairing the harbor painting with the original consignment letter and Harold's annotated infrared scan framed together under a placard that explained in plain language how a signature could be proven false. And the exhibition ran for 11 weeks, to the largest attendance the museum's education wing had recorded in 3 years. Ava kept a single line from the exhibition placard, one she had written herself, taped to the inside cover of the same leather notebook she had carried into the auction house that September evening. A thing is only ever worth what you can prove it is, and nobody can prove that for you but you. Nia represented 3 more clients that year, using the same slow-dated column-by-column method she had used at her own dining table, and she framed the legal pad from that first Saturday, the one with 9 entries in blue ink, and hung it in her office as a reminder that patience, not confrontation, was usually the fastest way to a real result. On a Sunday in November, in the kitchen of the small bungalow Ava had kept after the divorce, sunlight came low and orange through the window over the sink, the way it always had in late fall, catching the same corner where the harbor painting used to hang before it went to the museum. The kitchen had not changed much since Loretta's time, the same yellow curtains re-hemmed twice, the same chipped enamel kettle that still worked fine if you did not mind the whistle coming in 2 stages instead of 1. And Ava had never seen a reason to replace either. Ava stood at the counter, shelling peas into a bowl, a task with no urgency attached to it, the kind of task Loretta used to do slowly on purpose, and the jade ring, its 3 pieces reset by a jeweler on Devon Avenue, over 6 careful weeks, sat back on her right hand where it had always belonged. Daniel came in from the back porch carrying a grocery bag, set it on the counter without a word, and began unpacking it beside her seaweed and green onion and a block of tofu, the ingredients for a soup his grandmother had taught him to make on the anniversary of anyone in the family reaching a milestone worth marking quietly. He did not explain the soup, and Ava did not ask him to, because she had learned by then that some things in his family were carried rather than spoken, and she set her bowl of peas down long enough to hand him the good pot from the cabinet above the stove. They worked in silence for a while, the ordinary silence of 2 people who had already said the difficult things to each other months earlier and no longer needed to fill a kitchen with sound to prove anything to one another. His grandmother had died the previous spring, and Daniel had flown to Winnetka for the memorial dinner alone that year for the first time, and had come back 3 days later and told his mother over the phone that he intended to bring someone to next year's dinner if she was willing. A sentence Grace had received with a silence of her own that Daniel understood correctly as its own kind of yes. Ava rinsed the pot for him and set it on the stove, and when he asked without looking up from the cutting board whether she thought a person could ever fully separate what they built for themselves from what someone once tried to take from them, she considered it the way she considered a disputed attribution, carefully without rushing to the answer. She told him that she thought the 2 things stayed tangled forever, the building and the taking, and that the only real choice left to a person was which one they let stand at the center of the room. Outside, the light kept falling, the way November light does, unhurried and going nowhere in particular, and the soup came slowly to a simmer on the stove behind them.